Hello, we're continuing our conversations on Russia-Ukraine war. We've talked with some experts on Russian public opinion. We talked about Central Eastern Europe. We talked about specifically the situation in Belarus. And today, we would like to continue talking about more broader context about the geopolitical situation, so to speak, and various reactions to the Russia-Ukraine war from various countries. And it is my pleasure to talk to a colleague and a friend, Dr. Olena Lennon, who is a practitioner in residence of national security and at the University of New Haven, where she teaches courses on national security of the United States, foreign relations, and geopolitics. Olena, hello, how's it going?
Hi, Victor. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure. Look, Olena, we spoke, of course, before the conversation about what we are going to talk about, and I was open that I really think that in Lithuania, and primarily the audience of these conversations are Lithuanian general public, that in Lithuania, we tend, in my opinion, to oversimplify the status, if you will, of all the reactions to Russia-Ukraine war. What I mean by that is that we tend to think that, you know, Ukraine is obviously a victim, Russia is an aggressor, and then we all need to do as much as we can to help Ukraine. And with this, I think it's an easy logic to follow. But then we seem to conclude that anyone who doesn't go to the maximum or to the extreme of that help is somehow helping Russia, and then we tend to start criticizing and over criticize. Then we get lost in this friend and enemy distinction. So what I would like today to talk about with you, and maybe introduce a little bit of complexity in this picture. And, you know, I don't know if you will permit me, but I would like to start with Germany. I think Germany is one of the countries which is criticized most for its what is normally people tend to say, you know, they were defeated in the last two world wars, and then they became pacifist, and now they are so pacifist that they're passive and they are not assuming their role in European and global security, etc., etc. And Germany was very criticized when the full-scale Russian aggression started in 2022. However, there's another school of thought which says that Germany has done a lot, at least in their own terms, by sending weapons to Ukraine and trying to help Ukraine fight. Also, it changed its military doctrine, which is a big deal. So what is your take on German reaction and German position in this war, especially also keeping in mind that Germany had long and deep economic relations with Russia. So German industry and business relies a lot on Russian partners, so to speak.
Well, that's a lot of really good questions. Some of them that you actually already answered. I mean, first of all, I have to agree with you that you know, we're sort of observing this different responses around the world, and you know, the part of the world that you represent, in particular in the Baltics, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, there seems to be this sort of idea that the war in Ukraine, or Russia's war against Ukraine, presents this moral clarity, right? It's often presented as the war that just has perfect moral clarity, that it's there's the universal recognition of who the bad guys are and whose side history is on. And I mean, you're right that it's not, once you step out of that silo, right? Once you step out of that information space, then you will find that you could probably argue that the majority of the world, in fact, do not see Russia as an aggressor. They actually, and by the majority, I mean, if you just look at the sheer number of people that populate, places like China and India, that just those two countries alone make up almost half of the world. So even again, just in sheer numbers, it would become obvious that the majority of the world may not necessarily see the war in the same light as many Eastern and Central Europeans and people in the West do, in the proverbial kind of symbolic West that includes Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. But I will have to say, though, having said that, and yes, that is a problem that we sort of get consumed by our own, information silos, and also there is this perpetual confirmation bias, right? So we're all operating in self-validating positions and rely on the internet that provides us with self-validating information. If you and I were to Google the same question, then the results would be different, because it's based on, it confirms what we, Google gives us what we already believe in. And that's true for Lithuania as much as it is true for Brazil, the United States, and anywhere. So that's just the nature of the information environment in which we live. But I will have to say, though, as much as that kind of oversimplification is dangerous, and it may in fact create a very skewed perception of, the world. And sometimes when we say, the world, what we really mean is like-minded communities, right? So when we say, the world is outraged, or, this is a universally recognized moral issue, then what we usually imply by that is that people who agree with us are the world to us.
Yeah.
And then, other people are, live on a different planet, and, too bad for them. So that said, though, I will have to say that there is such thing, and I'm a political scientist first, then we do have to differentiate wartime and peacetime. I think in wartime, context is everything, right? So in wartime, that sort of intensification of certain identity and ideological cleavages is sort of normal and justifiable. Yes, people do cling to kind of more absolutist, hardcore ideological positions as a matter of survival, because war imposes these binary distinctions on us. In war, you cannot be undecided. You just don't have time to think about, oh, no, they have a point and they have a point. So in that way, war conditions and crisis conditions do impose these ideological binaries that people subscribe to, that actually serve a very good function. They really do give people that sense of clarity, and most importantly, a sense of urgency. What I notice in many sort of European responses, and you mentioned Germany, and we'll go there, is that there is a difference in the sense of urgency that people apply to what the appropriate response is, in terms of the amount and scale of military support, treatment of refugees, so the nuances of Ukraine's membership in NATO, when is the right time, what constitutes a hot war, when is it going to end? So there's all these different nuances on which people disagree, but what I see is kind of at the core of those differences and cleavages is a sense of urgency that is attached to it. So Germany seems to, German policymakers, I don't want to, overgeneralize, but there seems to be this sort of idea, and they've expressed it, openly many times, is that we have time, right? And just recently, one of the leading German think tanks published a report that estimated that, that NATO countries have at least 5 years before Russia presents a direct threat to a NATO country. And then the Poles pushed back and said, no, that's overestimated. We have a maximum 3 years. So even you see this in the way people perceive threat, how soon it comes, how urgent it is. So that's my way of saying that in some ways, I actually think that that position that you just expressed in terms of people in Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia in particular, believing as though the Russian threat is a much more acute, much more urgent, much more real and direct now, and then the world, those who are condemning the Russian aggression are in fact on the right side of history. So I don't necessarily think that that is an irrational response, right? Precisely because we live in wartime, and I mean, I don't need to tell you that the war is still dynamic and evolving. And so when you ask about the German position, even the German position has evolved and changed so many times, and it's still a developing story. So I will, in that way, I kind of want to give credit to certain populations in Eastern and Central Europe who continue to promote, to drum up support and advocate for more and more aid for Ukraine now, as a matter of European security, not just to help Ukraine liberate its territories, but also to stop Russian aggression in Ukraine if possible, and prevent the Russians from going any further. Because I think it's a normal psychological response of people who perceive that threat to be much more real to their survival, to their very existence. And that's why they resort to those oversimplified narratives and binary definitions, because it's sort of imposed by the sense of urgency. So there's two sides of that coin. Yes, it can be dangerous and exploited. And I think it's easier for Russia actually to exploit binary positions than to exploit this complexity of positions where people are informed and they have high levels of information literacy, where they fact check everything. So it's a lot more difficult to find fertile ground in information environments where you're dealing with people with high levels of information literacy, right? Who look at different points of view. They actually thrive. The Russian propaganda thrives in communities, in spaces where people are more likely to subscribe to more kind of reductionist, mutually exclusive ideological positions, bad and good. So there's two sides to that coin, and that's the complex answer, I guess, that you might have been looking for. Now, in terms of Germany, real quick, look, I mean, the German position is in some ways understandable relative to where they were. You could say that by far, Germany probably has transformed the most in terms of the tradition of not getting involved in any armed conflict as a matter of their military doctrine and national security doctrine. So relative to where they were 2 years ago, one could argue that Germany has actually made a lot of dramatic adjustments to their national security posture and military doctrine. That said, though, relative to the real world outside Germany, it's still a bit slow. It's obviously not it hasn't been as fast as perhaps would have been appropriate. But they've also coordinated their position with the US. And you remember when Germany waited for the US to start providing tanks before the Germans approved kind of scaling up military support. And now the Germans are waiting for the US to start providing long-range missiles before they feel as though they can. So they're constantly kind of waiting for it. It seems to me that they're still hesitant to assume that leadership position. And I think some of those hesitations are obviously ideological, historically motivated, as a country that sort of chose to demilitarize their foreign policy for obvious reasons, given the psychological and physical scars of 2 world wars. So I'm not ready to give Germany a pass. I would still, despite what might seem as legitimate reasons to have sort of this strategic hesitancy. or strategic patience, as they like to call it, because I think those are euphemisms that that politicians hide behind.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think we could see, if we could combine Germany's response with the Baltic response, I think we could find some middle ground that could be appropriate in terms of sense of urgency.
I really liked what you said about, the psychological feeling of one's relation to a war. In Lithuania, and I think in all three Baltic states, it's pretty common to hear in the public space politicians, but also influencers say, we are at war, meaning that, Russia-Ukraine war is also our war. I don't think that's the feeling in Germany. I think the feeling in Germany is that it's that war, and our goal is somehow not to get involved in that war. And I think that also perhaps informs how these two societies, or these two political entities, let's say, how they react to that. So if we consider ourselves to be part of the war, we are already at war. It's so much easier to to demand more from ourselves and also from others. While if you consider yourself just to be an external observer, then of course the logic is a bit different. Then you talk more about not escalating, or about how to find peace between these two warring factions, even if you think that one of them is perhaps more right and the other is more wrong, but then you just want this fight to end. So I really appreciate that that you said that, which leads me also to another European country, which I mean United Kingdom. And I'm not a political scientist, so please explain to me the status in international law of the so-called Bucharest Memorandum. The way I understand, Ukraine gave up. The way I understand it, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for guarantees from three superpowers, which was Russian Federation, United Kingdom, and United States of America, which guaranteed its territorial integrity. That happened in 1995. So one of the signatories blatantly violated Ukrainian territorial integrity as far back as 2014. How does that work in international politics? So United Kingdom and United States of America, being signatories of that memorandum, which the third signatory blatantly violated, they have at least a moral duty, I would say, to react. But is there any legal duty to react? And if there is, how is it enforced? Can you, because I remember when in 2014, there was a lot of talk about it, but somehow now everyone forgot it as if it was a completely meaningless paper.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. On the one hand, it's not a meaningless paper, but on the other hand, it is. And that's sort of kind of the paradox of international law, right? That international law agreements matter insofar as they're enforced, insofar as there is political will, insofar as there is national interest of great powers. So that said, I mean, they're not, my personal sort of theory is that international law works for middle-sized companies, that great powers ignore it and rogue states ignore it. So it seems to apply only to countries that are in one way or the other bound by those responsibilities. But a little bit about the Budapest Memorandum of 1994.
Was it Budapest, not Bucharest? I'm sorry. Yeah.
Right. So it's on the one, so first of all, and I really hate to kind of engage in this semantics, arguing legalese, which some people resort to, that the Budapest Memorandum provided security assurances, not guarantees. Obviously, and this is what lawyers would say, that it was not necessarily an agreement that in any way obligated, some would argue, the United States, the UK, or Russia for that matter, France, to defend Ukraine, right? So it's not Article 5. So simply put, it's not Article 5. So it's not the same. So the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, its main purpose was to provide security assurances, to make Ukraine feel more confident in Western support, but not necessarily rely on it. But that's of course, in retrospect, that's how Western politicians are now discussing it in retrospect, that look, not that we were so quick to violate and ignore those agreements. It's just that that particular memorandum did not necessarily obligate Western partners to protect Ukraine, right? But of course, again, those are just semantics. I'm not so sure that if the language in the Budapest Memorandum was security guarantees, not assurances, that would have necessarily changed anything, right? So, but the main sort of objective of that memorandum was really to provide Ukraine with enough incentives to forego its nuclear weapons, for Ukraine to seize its nuclear, to forego its nuclear status, to denuclearize. I still believe that that was the right decision. I know there's a lot of people right now, especially in Ukraine, that are sort of invoking Budapest Memorandum in favor of re-nuclearizing Ukraine to regain its nuclear status. And Ukrainian politicians have signaled many a time that they are ready to reconsider their nuclear status and actually start investing in nuclear weapons. I think that's mostly signaling. I don't think that that's because they believe that if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, then this wouldn't have happened. But if we were to kind of engage in this counterfactual analysis, right? So what could have happened, if under certain conditions? So first of all, one of the main objectives of the Budapest Memorandum was to set Ukraine on a pro-EU, pro-NATO, pro-Western geopolitical orientation. So Ukraine, the only reason Ukraine received loans and was sort of all these various cooperation agreements and partnerships on democratic reforms, partnership with NATO, and various other programs that set Ukraine on the pro-EU path. And by the way, pro-EU, pro-NATO geopolitical orientation is constitutionally defined in Ukraine. So it's not even a matter of who comes to power in Ukraine. And Ukraine is probably one of the more perfect democracies because it has, since its independence, it's rotated leaders every election. Only one president got reelected. But other than that, it's a one-term presidency since 1991. So in that way, I mean, it's a pretty robust democracy with a kind of a regular rotation of leadership. This is precisely what we want to see in a democracy, which means that regardless of who prior to the big invasion came to power in Ukraine, pro-EU, pro-NATO orientation was solidified in Ukraine's constitution. So it's an official Ukrainian position to pursue integration with European institutions. Whether they're formalized, how they're formalized and configured is a different issue. And the only reason Ukraine was able to get on that path of pro-Western orientation and receive all that support was because it gave up its nuclear weapons. Let's just say that the trajectory of Ukraine's pro-Western orientation would have been very different had it not kind of pursued that track from the start. So that 1994 memorandum, that agreement and that decision, that was obviously incentivized by Western leaders, that there was enough pressure and incentives, it's carrot and stick, right?
Yeah.
Both. And that really led to this decision in Ukraine to make this very dramatic change in their geopolitical status, because I think you need a PhD in political science to know that the ultimate leverage is nuclear leverage. And that's the unfortunate reality that a lot of countries are now grappling with is sort of further realization that if there's anything that the last 2 years or even Russia's aggression against Ukraine of the past 10 years has shown, is that, unfortunately, in the current geopolitical environment, nuclear weapons are the ultimate leverage. And of course, you could argue then that Ukraine lost its leverage in 1994, but at the same time, again, it's not that straightforward, right? It's not as though, if you added nuclear weapons, that Ukraine would have been the same country, but with nuclear weapons. No, Ukraine would have been a very different country had it retained its nuclear weapons. It would have probably remained in even under more direct control of Russia. If Ukraine, held on to its nuclear weapons, then it would have probably been more centrally controlled from Moscow. So there's a lot of kind of counterfactuals to consider there. But my bottom line is that I still believe that the Budapest Memorandum was the correct move at that time. I do think that Western leaders underperformed, and underreacted. And I think historians, look, it's still it's only year 2. It's the 10 years since the big invasion, but from the historical point of view, when historians look back at this time, I think they will judge us, and they're not going to be nice to us in the West, because it's very clear to us even now that the decisions that should have been made 2 years ago were not made 2 years ago to create the effect that we need now, right? So indecisions are consequential, right? So the things that we want to see now, those decisions should have been stacked up for the last 2 years to have the right amount of support, to have the right amount of weapons, military aid, sanctions, diplomatic isolation. All those decisions should have been incrementally made 2 years ago, or even in 2014, to create the effect, to create the deterrent effect, or defensive effect that we want to see now. So we want Ukraine to succeed, but we didn't make decisions that would have been needed for Ukraine to succeed 2 years ago. So I think now, in retrospect, now that we have the luxury of retrospective analysis, that it's been 2 years, I think it's a long time in some ways, to understand that Western leaders underreacted and underperformed. And I think it's been clear, but it's increasingly more clear. And the Budapest Memorandum is just one example of how, without political will, these agreements are just paper. And Russia knows that. Look, Russia is the kind of power that only reacts to behavior. Russia does not react to signatures on papers. So anybody who thinks that you can bring Russia to a negotiating table and have the Russians sign anything, it will not matter one bit. Russia only reacts. That's how they execute their foreign policy. It's all action-based, not agreements. Russia is, as somebody once said, Russia doesn't do agreements. Russia only does deals. And I think that's the kind of actor they are, and we need to. I think we need to meet them where they are. We need to show with our behavior what we mean when we say that we will defend Ukraine. And by we, I mean the West, the proverbial West. So I don't put a lot of stock in Budapest Memorandum. It doesn't, I'm not as, probably not, because I'm a lot more skeptical as a political scientist of international agreements, knowing that great powers will, without hesitation, violate them, including, the UK, the US, France, if it's in the name of national interest. The one main function, in my opinion, that international law serves is that it makes the world a little bit more predictable. It reduces uncertainty to an extent. It's sort of, when we have these various rules and norms codified in international law, at least we have a higher level of predictability that, countries will abide by them, maybe or maybe not, but at least it reduces uncertainty. And sometimes, reducing uncertainty, and it may be a pretty low bar, I will concede that, but reducing uncertainty in international relations sometimes becomes actually, in and of itself, an objective.
Well, I listening to you, about the nuclear weapons, I thought, of course, about Belarus as well, because as we know, Russia deployed tactical nuclear weapons now in Belarus, and I think no one would say that Belarus has become stronger as a country because of that. I think it's the opposite, as you say. It is the sign that Belarus is now much more centrally governed from Moscow, and that so it is a good argument to say that whatever happened, it was perhaps quite prudent for Ukraine to give away its nuclear arsenal. However, I mentioned this memorandum not in order to question Ukraine's wisdom, but thinking more about the reaction of the signatories. So, because I think, I don't know if you will agree with me, but I think United Kingdom, and we'll get to the United States of America next, but United Kingdom in Europe, apart from Eastern European countries, was the most vocal, and not just vocal, but also one of the most active in its military support. And we remember Boris Johnson visiting Kiev. He was one of the first after the full-scale invasion to go there. So for me, it's always the question, because I don't consider myself an expert, is it kind of geopolitical game, or is it looking back to internal politics? Because we know that Boris Johnson at the time had quite a few problems in his own country, and so sometimes international politics is just a good distraction. So, but yeah, my question was, was United Kingdom active because it has more or it considers that it has more obligations to Ukraine, or was it just kind of a coincidence and a completely separate political game from the United Kingdom?
I think it's both. I mean, as somebody once said, all politics is local politics at the end of the day. Absolutely both. I think on the one hand, in the UK, support for Ukraine is perceived as one with absolute moral clarity, and it's sort of, if you, and it's sort of used and exploited, if you will. In this case, it's for a good cause, to galvanize domestic support, to distract people. It's sort of this diversionary politics, right? So where voters, supporters, or constituents are distracted by issues that are easier to galvanize around, as opposed to more contested positions pertaining to domestic politics. So I think there's definitely that side that makes support for Ukraine an issue that resonates more easily, right? That does have that sort of moral appeal to it, and presents British leaders and Boris Johnson, you mentioned, in positive light as a champion of democracy, as a champion of international law. But at the same time, obviously, I think one of the advantages and disadvantages of democratic countries is that they are held accountable by their voters. They do need to cater to domestic audiences, because their re-election depends entirely on how well the needs of their specific constituents are met. In that way, they're bound by public opinion. They have to respond to public opinion. So that creates a vulnerability in democratic countries, because then politicians are sometimes too bound by changes in public opinion that could be a function of, various things, including disinformation campaigns from Russia. If public opinion sways, then politicians have to respond to it to stay popular. So it could be actually, I think it could be a downside. Obviously, that's how democracies are supposed to operate, that the public should exert influence on political decisions, but sometimes to a fault, right? Because when the public opinion changes due to various disinformation campaigns, and then politicians find themselves having to adjust to those positions, then that creates changes in foreign policy that may or may not be actually productive. But in the case of the UK, I agree with you completely that it is, I think it's driven both by considerations of domestic support, garnering domestic support, but also a much more acute sense of urgency than in the US. I think If you talk to military leaders in the UK that are a little bit, more sort of tracking more sort of military side of things, and by the way, British intelligence has been, on par with the U.S. intelligence in terms of providing that, battlefield intelligence in real time to the Ukrainian military, and the British intelligence has been robust in detecting those early signals of the invasion. And in their intelligence services and military leaders have responded to these early signals that Russia was preparing invasion. And throughout this whole military campaign, I think the British intelligence services have performed exceptionally in terms of detecting and sharing information, and really like drumming up this sense of urgency that that we shouldn't be giving the Russians the benefit of the doubt that this is just a coercive diplomacy campaign, or that they don't have any plans to go any further. So I think that one of the ways in which I think the UK played a critical role in a Western response is precisely drumming up this sense of urgency based on military intelligence. That, and their intelligence collecting capabilities are as robust as America's. In that way, I think their contribution was actually critical in shaping the narrative surrounding the Russian military campaign as one that has potential to, I don't want to use the word spill over, because no, wars don't spill over. There are always political objectives pursued, that it's not an accident that war just spills over, right, to a NATO country, that if Russia brings war to a NATO territory, then there will be a political objective behind it. So currently, I think I'm sort of in a more conservative camp that believes that I don't necessarily think that the Russians have the capability to engage in any direct confrontation with a NATO country. I think they want to, but they simply are not capable of delivering on those ambitions. But for the UK, obviously geographic proximity alone presents a very different threat perception picture. So they realize that the Russians can, that the potentiality that would involve British troops engaging the Russians directly on the battlefield is much higher than obviously for the Americans. But I don't necessarily think that that is a real possibility right now. But I do think that the British attach a much higher sense of urgency and significance and probability to Russia actually more directly threatening a NATO country, whether it's with conventional weapons, or in any sort of gray zone operations, so asymmetrically that would involve a cyber attack or some kind of low intensity, small scale border disputes. So I think all of those are perceived as much more probable events from the British point of view. And I think a lot of it has to do with threat perception. But our threat perception is informed by, collective memory, historical memory, sort of psychological traumas, geographic proximity. And when you travel outside the United States, as soon as you leave the US and arrive somewhere in Vilnius, then all of a sudden you have this as a much more acute awareness that there is a war on this continent, right? That there is a massive conventional war happening. It's in the air.
Absolutely.
Everybody's talking about it. It's such a different information environment. And I think it really shapes people's perception of how direct the threat is to them. How rational it is, how empirical it is, it may or may not be, but perceptions are real. And I do think that the British are demonstrating that much more acute perception of threat as being much more immediate and much more direct than here in the United States, and for understandable reasons.
Yeah. However, I will pick up on that. However, I think me spending now this academic year in the United States, I can see that in America, Russia is an enemy in historical memory, so to speak. I think there are these leftovers of Cold War, so it's quite easy for Americans to think of Russia as, as an adversary, kind of for a long time now. So in that sense, you don't have to explain to Americans that Russia has done something bad yet again. It's they just sigh and say, "Oh, those guys again. We need to deal with them." So and I think I don't know if you would agree, but I think American response was pretty swift and active, and they took leadership, especially I think since perhaps Bush administration, at least in my part of the world, Americans we kind of gave up on American leadership. I think Obama and Trump administrations, for many reasons that they were different. One similarity was that they were trying to withdraw from international affairs. So America didn't want to be the policeman of the world anymore. And I think Biden kind of brought back that vibe that Americans are willing to take responsibility for things that are happening in the world. However, and you spoke already about that in the context of UK, I think that American public has become a little bit tired of this topic, if you will. And the last year, I've seen some polls where it shows just dramatic drop in support for sending weapons to Ukraine in the last year, all across the board, among Democrats supporting, among Republicans supporting, among independents. And so I wonder, and also we saw that Biden's administration had difficulty pushing through the votes in the Congress to send yet another round of military aid to Ukraine. So could you talk a little bit about the reasons why? Am I correct that this mood is changing? So now we are almost 2 years into the war, and that Americans are perhaps getting tired, and also there's another issue of another war, which is perhaps much more important for Americans, which is Israel-Hamas war. And so am I right in this impression that there is some change of mood in the sense of this urgency and also the enthusiasm for support for Ukraine in America?
Yes and no. There's no such thing as public opinion in America. There's no such thing as American opinion, right? It really depends. You go from state to state, constituency to constituency, and then you'll find varying levels of support. And that is precisely what's in play here, is the fact that there are so many opinions in America, and they're all contested and they're competing for political power, and it has everything to do with pre-election campaign. And that is the main event in the US that is shaping all of these responses. So that, that actually provides, that's what make actually in some ways it's bad for continuous support, but in other ways, it is exactly what makes me optimistic, is the fact that American public actually do pay attention to foreign events, do pay attention to foreign policy, and they have power over, they have a choice in electing or not electing leaders that actually support that point of view, their point of view. So so what I see in the United States right now is, last time I looked at public opinion polls, that there's actually a pretty strong correlation between American public declining support in the American public who identify themselves as Republican. So it's not just the Republican leaders, and there's a small minority of Republican representatives in Senate in particular that are the so-called hardcore isolationists, inspired by Trump in particular, and that sentiment matches changes in public opinion in the general American population, who also more sort of increasingly identify as Republican. So there is a partisan divide. But as any partisan divide, these partisan issues are amplified and actually, created by media. So it's all about what media sources people consult to inform their points of view. So, and then the aid for Ukraine is just one of many issues where you can see this delineation based on, it's very clear that if people consult, if people are sort of bombarded with messages coming out of conservative media, then they're more likely to think that the more aid for Ukraine, so more aid for Ukraine basically stands for America last position. So they draw that straight line, aid for Ukraine takes away from, our communities, which is of course not true at all. That's not how budgets work. It's not, some pot of money that if you take more for Ukraine, there's less for, American farmers. It's not at all how national budgets work, but that's how they equate it in their heads based on what they're told by media. And then, so it's entirely a function of what information environment people operate in, what sort of information silos. So that said, though, I have to say that, what makes me optimistic for, American politics and the fact that, American voters will actually make informed decisions and will not, kind of descend to this flawed analogies and false equivalences, is the fact that, well, first of all, it's a very small minority of Republicans that are more ideologically driven, that are isolationist in nature, but it's a small number. Now, other Republicans that are opposing aid for Ukraine, congressionally approved, so this major allocation in the defense budget. No, the aid will continue. I just want to kind of make a disclaimer that America's aid for Ukraine will continue. Whether by presidential drawdown or congressionally approved funds. So right now, I mean, Democrats are fighting to obviously for congressionally approved allocations in some ways as to protect this money from a potential Trump presidency, where by presidential decree, Trump actually has the power of executive order to change to scale down or up any level of support. So by having it, congressionally approved, obviously Democrats are sort of preparing for a more long-term engagement. But pragmatic Republicans ideologically still remain supporters of Ukraine. So these are more pragmatic, like Mitch McConnell, for example, who are not necessarily hardcore isolationists, but they're using aid for Ukraine to leverage, to calibrate to get something, to gain something, to improve their rankings, to obviously to influence election outcomes. So in that way, actually, that's sort of pragmatic. And yes, it's not necessarily, it's obviously just how politics operates that, unfortunately, aid for Ukraine that is existential for Ukraine, survival for Ukraine, is being held hostage. And then I think this is a very cynical, very hypocritical position. But on the other hand, at the very least, it's negotiable. There are still ways in which Democrats and Republicans can negotiate and calibrate those positions that makes congressionally approved funds for Ukraine possible. Because I don't see any hardline ideological disagreements to where sort of providing this, sustaining Ukraine in its fight against Russia is in any way sort of a hard ideological position. So I don't see that among Republican leaders, other than a very small minority who are, again, like I said, sort of more radical. By and large, as you said, I think that the American foreign policy apparatus is still, for the most part, shaped by Cold War hangover, so to speak, by this understanding that the way Russia does foreign policy is by never-ending, ongoing shaping and influence operations. So Russia does political warfare 24/7. They never stop. Yeah. They don't react, right? It's constantly shaping the environment, conditioning populations all the time, whether it's overtly or covertly, influencing election outcomes, conditioning public opinion. So the Russians are at it all the time. That's the Soviet Union legacy, where these call them active measures or asymmetric measures. But that's the legacy of the Soviet Union that sort of created these propaganda machines that operate around the world 24/7 in kind of shaping public opinion in favor of Russia and also feeding on this anti-American, again, Russian propaganda finds fertile ground. They will find any existing differences. They draw on existing tensions. And in places like Latin America or Middle East or Africa, anti-American, anti-colonial narratives resonate. So that the Russians will exploit that and then will amplify those. So that said, I think Americans have a pretty good intuition and understanding that Russian influence operations don't stop, and they will continue working against America. And this is what gives me hope, this sort of knowing that American political culture is still pretty fine-tuned in terms of detecting Russian influences and understanding Russian threat, and they will continue leading and keeping the collective West front unified. And I think that's the main role that America plays right now, is just keeping everybody focused on supporting Ukraine and keeping Europeans unified to the extent that they can. Again, so the blessing in disguise, I suppose, is as cynical as this position is, holding Ukrainian aid hostage. On the other hand, this is precisely what presents real possibility or makes aid more possible, knowing that these are pragmatic calculations, not ideological, right? So they're not, they don't contradict that kind of deep-seated ideological, let's say, an admiration of Russia, for example. So it's not like Serbia, right, where this fascination with the Russian Orthodoxy and this loyalty to Russian Orthodoxy is more sentimental. So I don't think Americans are nearly as sentimental about anything that could be considered pro-Russian. So they're very pragmatic. So again, it's both an advantage and disadvantage. But and then just lastly, I just want to say too, historically, exploiting foreign aid, especially military aid, has historically, traditionally been one of the more divisive and polarizing pre-election, especially during election issues. Whether it's aid for whether it's continuing military operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, or even going earlier in time in Vietnam, it's always military aid that ends up being exploited to delineate to calibrate political positions, because it resonates very easily with the American, defunding the war. There's nothing more that resonates more than fund the war, defund the war, fund the war, defund the war. So the American public is very easily galvanized around this idea. So why are we funding all these wars? And then the details get lost. All they hear is there's a war somewhere, we're not involved. Why are we funding it? Which of course is not true, because Americans are just as affected by the war as the Europeans are. European security is as an integral part of American security. And I think that Americans just forgot the fact that the only reason the United States as an economic powerhouse is precisely because we invested in European security after World War II. And that gave us this huge market that made us prosperous.
Yeah.
So I'm optimistic. My bottom line, Victor, is I don't see any hardcore ideologies that would prevent the United States from continuing the support. And I think that post-election, even with Trump, we will find a way.
Well, that's my next question. I'm very happy you say that, because I had so much less optimism, but I have to trust you because you're more knowledgeable. So thanks for that. But I wanted also to ask you, given all the unpredictability of the person, Donald Trump, let's imagine, talk to me a little bit, what can we expect if he becomes a president? So, I mean, I'm not asking about Joe Biden because I think it's more of the same, and perhaps even better, because as you explained very eloquently, the next 12 months or so will be difficult because of the election. So there will be quite nasty debates, and perhaps Ukraine will be, the aid to Ukraine will be hostage to these political debates in the election year. That's expected to happen. But if Biden gets re-elected, then we can expect the aid to continue more or less smoothly. However, with Donald Trump, it's not so clear. And also, I really like your take that, that it's transactional rather than ideological. That it's actually in our favor, in those who want more aid for Ukraine, in our favor, because then we can negotiate, we can offer some price. However, I think that with Donald Trump, I don't know if you will agree, and he's clearly also not an ideological politician, he's transactional, but I think his transactionality is really not on the national level, but rather on the personal level, in the sense of his own, private benefit, not even political gain, but just much more direct. And in that sense, does it really mean that, we're talking about just basically buying an American president to get him to make decisions in our favor? But that clearly can't be the path forward. So, but yeah, basically my question is, could you talk to us a little bit what to expect if, in terms of Ukraine, I'm not talking because there's loads of issues with Donald Trump becoming a president and just on its own, but just within the context of Russia-Ukraine war, what could we expect in the change in American policy?
I'm actually of an opinion that we're not going to see a dramatic change necessarily. It's actually quite interesting that if you look at the last 30 years of American foreign policy, then it's actually been quite consistent in terms of sort of this moderated. Look, even Obama, I think, underperformed, and Democrats also underreacted to 2014 invasion. They basically just decided to forgive Crimea, just kind of pretend that it didn't happen. And I think that was the first major flaw in American foreign policy that has persisted in terms of constantly giving Russia the benefit of the doubt. Republicans and Democrats continue giving Putin the benefit of the doubt. We're so quick to talk about resets and normalizing our relationship with Russia. We really just want to normalize war. And it keeps escalating. And I don't know what other signs Americans need to understand that every time we normalize, Russia escalates. So that said, that's sort of my sort of general read of the foreign policy establishment, Republicans and Democrats, that there is that sort of continued treatment of Putin as a normal leader. So I really and I was glad to see that finally, the Biden administration finally changed the rhetoric, changed the narrative, and actually responded in a categorical way that this will not be tolerated, and this is an egregious violation of all norms, and that Americans will support Ukraine. So Donald Trump, though, I try to be, I'm cautiously optimistic here. Yes, absolutely. There's every reason to believe that if Trump is elected as the next president, then it will likely mean bad news for continued military aid that will allow Ukraine to kind of sustain its defensive and offensive operations, let alone regain its territory. That said, what gives me hope is precisely that transactionalism that you referred to. Is that, look, one of the main industries, one of the leading industries that is actually coming up on top here is benefiting from this military aid is the U.S. defense industry. the defense industrial complex is actually benefiting quite a bit, because they're getting more and newer contracts, and more production facilities are being built around the country that have been scaled down. Now they're scaling up production. It's more jobs in the defense sector. The Americans are ramping up their ammunition production. The javelins that they give to Ukrainians, they're going to replenish those and build better versions, more advanced versions. There is a scaled up production of long-range missiles, drones, you name it. That's huge for the defense industrial complex. And so my sense is, my intuition is that somehow, defense lobbyists will find their way to Trump's heart and mind, and I think they can sell it to him. I can put you in the room with Trump and you'll sell something to him. I have no doubt. So I think in that way, Trump being so transactional, and I don't think Trump has any hardcore ideological positions necessarily, other than, he is an entertainer, right? He caters to, he reads the room, right? He caters to his audience. I'm actually more concerned for some of the hardcore interest groups in the US that are so anti-immigration and pro-isolationism, as ideological positions that could influence Trump. But I also think that the benefits to American economy in actually procuring capabilities for Ukraine, not just giving. So far, Americans have only given Ukraine what we have in stockpiles. The industry has not really been producing or filling those contracts to replenish capabilities for Ukraine. So that will be with the next defense budget. And I think that given the economic opportunities and how profitable that could potentially be for American defense industry and for our arms export overseas in general, I think that could be a selling point to Trump. I really do. I don't think he will ever galvanize. He's not one who will, kind of get socialized into a support system based on democracy and sovereignty and protection of human rights. But I do think he could be talked into congressionally approved funding for Ukraine's military aid as a matter of investment, as an investment into America's defense industrial base.
Well, you're giving us hope. You're giving us hope. Thanks a lot for that. Our time is coming to an end, but I really want to ask at least two more questions. One concerns a huge continent, but yeah, we can't delve too much into detail. But I really want to ask you about Africa, and a lot of African countries were, I should say, to a great surprise in Lithuania, were quite reserved in their reaction to the Russian aggression against Ukraine in 2022. And I remember in Lithuania, in public discourse, there were debates and accusations that Africans, they don't understand what's happening, and they should show solidarity, because this is basically another example of imperial aggression against a former colony. So who else, if not African countries, should understand that? And so could you talk to us a little bit? And inevitably it will be generalized, so we understand that. But could you talk to us a little bit about why African countries did not follow that narrative, or did not follow that narrative in unison or so enthusiastically as my compatriots seem to expect?
Right. I mean, that's a really good example of how Russian information campaigns and influence campaigns have really garnered, have really found a captive audience, right? It really, they found all the right hot buttons, all the right messages to appeal to African populations. Now, there's two caveats to that. Is that how much that kind of shaping public opinion actually translates into the decisions that African leaders make, because it's not, most countries in Africa are not necessarily perfect democracies, right? Just because the Russians spend so much money and there's an established infrastructure for those information and influence operations, right? It didn't start 2 years ago, right? The Russians have been operating in Africa, and Wagner, the private military contract company, is just one example of Russian influence operations that have, a combat in the military component. But I think one of the main narratives that's really sticking in Africa is this idea that, the food shortages, energy shortages, rising food prices as a result of not receiving, grain exports being compromised out of Ukraine and Russia, that the Russians presented all the problems that many countries in Africa and North Africa in particular, Middle East, experience with food shortages, that is creating a lot of instability, that it's the continued Western disregard for the developing world, that the West just doesn't care about that region, that it's because of Western sanctions on Russia, that people in Africa are experiencing food shortages, that the Russians want to export their grain, but it's the decadent, evil West that's preventing them because they don't care about people in Africa. And that's just part of that kind of the continued imperial colonial treatment of Africa and it's also racist, right? That is not equal in its importance, right, to European population. So they really do spin those in a way that resonates with people, that it's just continued disregard of Western powers, of people in Africa. And then when they impose sanctions on Russia and compromise delivery of grain to their countries, that is precisely because the West is punitive. It aims to punish Russia and completely overlook the needs of people in the developing world. So this is kind of how Russia presents it. It's not because the Russians blockaded the Black Sea and prevented the shipment of grain, but it's because of Western sanctions. So that's one reason. Also, they also capitalize on these narratives of look at how Ukrainian refugees were treated in Europe, welcomed and embraced and integrated, and that's just not how Syrian refugees or people from war-torn countries in Africa have been treated in Europe. So there's obviously Europeans are racist in their treatment of refugees, but ultimately, so there's this anti-colonial, like you said, that it resonates with particularly in countries like Libya and Egypt, Mali, where Wagner operates, that it is NATO. It's that the war, this was triggered by NATO expansion, that NATO is basically a military component of Western colonialism, that indiscriminately that brings war to destabilizes countries and changes power dynamics. But ultimately, this is Western colonialism, and NATO is an arm of Western colonialism. And so anti-NATO, anti-imperial narratives really do resonate with populations there. But I think but that's just more sort of on the kind of softer side of things. I think more pragmatically, even though these narratives resonate with general populations, I think the fact that the Russians just do arms deals and various other illicit financial transactions with African dictators who hold power and who control populations is a more, I guess, convincing argument, right? So the Russians, first of all, Wagner operated in places like Mali and Eritrea, and have an established infrastructure of not just promoting pro-Russian narratives. They have their own radio stations. RT operates in 30 different languages, so they really do spread their narratives. But Wagner also presented itself as a security guarantor African dictators hired Wagner mercenaries to provide security, right? To outsource, to stabilize, to deconflict, civil unrest. So they're viewed. The image that has been projected over the past 10 years is that Russia is a security guarantor. That that Russia is the only power, is an anti-colonial power, and the historical kind of loyalties there are that the Soviet Union sort of helped in sort of massive anti-colonial, post-colonial independence movement in after World War II in from about 1945 to about 65, where this sort of a major decolonization movement that the Soviet Union facilitated by arming African leaders to fight colonial powers. And so those connections resonate in people's memory that Russia is the only great power, well, and China, obviously, that support decolonization, but that support is very direct. Look, Africa is one of the largest buyers of Russian arms, of Russian weapons. And as whatever you think of Russia, it thinks of itself as a great power, and great power needs allies. And right now, North Korea is about all. So the Russians are really working hard on sort of generating this image of a great power that is needed, that is benevolent, that other people rely on in fighting, their own, or fighting for their own causes. So all of those things resonate, but I think the main reason still is more direct economic, illegal ties between African dictators and the Kremlin, and arms transfers between the two sides. But Russia is also interested in raw materials. There's a very, kind of pragmatic reason there as well, that keeps their economy, that keeps Russian economy and a lot of African economies alive. So those financial transactions actually do convert into income, right, into profit for African leaders. So unfortunately, I as much as effective as the Russians are in Africa in promoting these anti-colonial narratives, I think that if you look at public opinion polls, the populations in Africa are actually not as quick to support Russia. We're actually seeing growing levels of condemnation. But whether that opinion translates into decisions, it's not, like in Lithuania and Germany, right, where politicians sort of are held accountable. So I'm more worried about the fact that the Russians just have a more direct influence on propping up dictators and kind of securing them in their in power, and then shaping opinions, because those opinions do not necessarily translate into political decisions.
One example which I thought of is that, as much as Russia needs allies in Africa, I think, those of us who support Ukraine, we could look at that as another battlefield. And, to win opinions, hearts and minds in Africa would be beneficial for Ukraine. However, I thought, if we start the narrative by saying that Russia is trying to reconstruct Soviet Union, that sounds like a fatal argument in the Baltic states and Ukraine, and in Africa it doesn't sound like anything bad, because Soviet Union doesn't mean anything like it means in the Baltic states. It actually was a great ally against their own colonial powers, as you mentioned, during the Cold War era. So, which for me, the outtake of that is that we have to pay more attention to the sensibilities of those whom we want to be our partners and allies, and to their historical memory, and to their interest in this moment in time. Last question, and it's going to be even broader than the previous ones, but after the Hamas attack on October the 7th on Israel, there was, and I think there has been a lot of talk about, that there's this global fight going on, either between civilizations, so one is the Western one and the other is Eastern or Arab or and whatnot. And another argument, which is more relevant to our discussion, is that there are democracies fighting against tyrannies or dictatorships. And so I've seen quite a few commentators saying, so there is a new axis of evil or refined axis of evil, where Hamas, Iran, Russia, China, North Korea kind of stand and coordinate their efforts, and they're trying to defeat democracies globally. I'm not sure about this stake, in the sense that I don't kind of believe that there is an alliance formed among all these dictatorships. I think they share some interests and they have some diverging interests. And so I see a risk of actually kind of, when we put them all in one basket, we actually pushing them to form that alliance, because we treat them all as, one entity. So, but that's just my take, or take of an amateur observer. What do you think? How big is the risk of this really kind of global alliance of tyrannies or dictatorships forming? Because then the threat is completely different. Then, of course, we have to say that Russia is just part of this global effort. Where I think China is whichever way you look at it, is a much more powerful adversary than Russia. So my question is, how coordinated are the efforts of these countries, and should we treat them as one entity?
That's a really good question. Yes and no. I think there's definitely a value to sort of consolidating those positions, based on value systems, right? I think that it has served Europe and the collective West pretty well in sort of advancing these narratives that it's, we are unified based on our belief in democracy, that, we stand united against tyranny and dictatorship. I think in that way, that oversimplification does really serve a good purpose, because it really does give people a sense of purpose and kind of a sense of value system around which we galvanize and that we share in. Again, in wartime, I think it serves a really good purpose, kind of knowing that orientation, even for your own sanity. But at the same time, it does feed into this narrative that this is precisely how Russia wants this war to be portrayed, that it's NATO versus Russia, that it's the West against the Russian civilization, orthodoxy. I mean, the Russians presented as a civilizational battle, right? That it's decadent West trying to erode, old orthodox traditions, the Russian civilization. In regimes like in these highly personalized authoritarian regimes as that Russia is, survival of the regime is equated with the survival of the Russian civilization. So survival of Putin's regime is is indoctrinated, it's codified in their military doctrine as a direct threat to the Russian civilization, right? And I think that so when we're not really, so we're basically doing them a big favor by exacerbating, by amplifying this exact binary division, right? That it's the West versus Russia, or the East. And I think that that's how the Chinese want to see it too. They want to create an alternative vector of global power to the US, because there's no other issue matters more to China than Taiwan. And I think there is fears, especially given the most recent election in Taiwan, that solidified that anti-China, pro-Western position, that there's real fears in China that that Taiwan may feel inspired by, Western unity in support of Ukraine, and that the West did not fracture how the Russians expected the West to fracture. It did not fracture. That the West kind of stood, for the most part, united. Even Bulgaria recently caved and finally signed on sanctions against Russian energy. So countries have made some dramatic, from Bulgaria to Germany, dramatic changes in their hardcore kind of geopolitical positions. So, and I think that's something that the Russians did not count on. They didn't think that the support would be this strong, and it's not lost on China that the West can, in fact, mobilize itself, right? Economically, financially, militarily. So that said, Russia, China needs Russia to kind of create this alternative axis vector of power to compete with the United States. But at the same time, I think when I don't necessarily subscribe to democracy versus autocracy type of a kind of geopolitical moment that we're in. And the reason for that is mainly because democracy is a process, right? It's never achieved, right? Democracy is a constant fight. We have to constantly fight to maintain our democracy. We have to constantly check our biases. We have to constantly observe elections, make sure that rotate leaders, right? It's a constant battle. Now, autocracies are all set, you set for, centuries. We think of time in terms of election cycles, unfortunately, sometimes. Yeah. China and Russia think of time in terms of generations. Putin is fighting for historical legacy that will shape generations. We're now fighting for the next budget, right? That's good for 2 years. So, and I think there are some, very, I think, real sort of ideological differences and in terms of how we perceive government forms. But at the same time, I think sometimes when people talk about, fight of democracy versus autocracy, that also assumes that democracies are well defined and they're they have mission accomplished, right? That we know what we're doing and we are all united. But by definition, democracy is a perpetual struggle of opinions. And it's where consensus is not a good thing. Again, sort of when we say, democracy is a unified front, that also implies, we're going to expect consensus from everybody. And that's just not what democracy is, right? So it's just not that binary. So, and that's why I'm not as quick to jump on that train, only because I don't necessarily take a lot of comfort in the fact that, the United States is a democracy, because I know it's a very fragile democracy. We are just as vulnerable. So I don't really necessarily want to get, cocky that, we are a robust democracy and we're going to fight autocracies, because we are just as vulnerable to autocratic leadership as, any other country. It's human nature. Part of it is just the kind of that politics corrupts. Some of it is the influence of power on, human psychology. So I think it's a perpetual struggle, and the important thing is not to get cocky and self-indulgent in this idea that we're, we have the right values and they don't, and they're autocrats, right? Because the moment we start, slipping or going down that rabbit hole, then I think we'll elect. I mean, look at election. This is a global election year, and I'm really worried to see how they will play out, because people sometimes just take things for granted and they think that their democracy will protect them and will save them, forgetting to do the work that needs to be done daily to maintain those democracies and keep their leaders accountable. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I don't see democracy and autocracy as mutually exclusive. You know what I mean? I think that everybody has equal chance of kind of going down that rabbit hole if they lose sight of their own flaws and if they take shortcuts. And look, and we talk about dictators in Africa or Middle East or elsewhere in Latin America or the US, Russia. They use legitimate financial institutions for many of their illicit transactions. The Western financial system allows for these illicit financial networks to operate. So there's a lot of corruption that's been legalized that enables dictators via these illicit networks that, come out of London and New York and Paris, places of this world. So so I don't find this blame game constructive and sort of pointing fingers at I mean, obviously there's a matter of degree, right? We're not as corrupt and violent, but I don't think we should get self-indulgent in our democracy.
Well, I think that at least what we have to point out is that Western democracies have collaborated, are collaborating, and will continue to collaborate with a lot of dictatorships. So it's being a dictatorship does not make you immediately an enemy, however virtuous we think we are. So it's I think that's another reason to be a bit skeptical about this idea that these are democracies fighting dictatorships. I think it's just more that we tend to write into one, or to throw into one basket, all the countries that tend to be very negative or adversarial towards us, and we say, oh, they must be friends among them. However, that is not always the case. But yeah, it's fascinating how it's gonna play out. However, I think, for the most part, our region, especially the Baltic states, of course, we are quite naturally, we spoke about it. We are very, very worried about the situation in our region, and especially in Ukraine. Ukrainians are continuing to fight. I can't stop being amazed the braveness and the energy that Ukrainians have shown. I was fortunate enough to visit Ukraine 2 times last year. It's just amazing. It really is. Olena, thanks a lot. It was really fascinating. I've learned a lot. I have another 15 questions which I didn't ask you, maybe next time. But for the moment, we stop here. I really appreciate you coming on and for your time and for your answers. It was really, really interesting and useful. Thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks so much, Victor. And until next time.
Yeah.